Taehyung abruptly ends a live interview after being asked, "Is Jungkook invited?" What was meant to be a celebration becomes a storm of unspoken truths. "I think we're done here," Taehyung said flatly, removing his mic as the host froze mid-sentence, the crew around him suddenly silent, the air sharp with tension and confusion as his knuckles whitened from clenching the armrest. The question that triggered the storm had been simple. Perhaps too simple. "Is Jungkook invited to your wedding?" The cameras were still rolling. The lights stayed on, but the interview had stopped breathing. The silence that followed didn't just stretch, it tore through the room like a scream held inside the chest for too long. Taehyung didn't look at the host, nor at the camera, nor at the team who sat stunned behind monitors. He stared ahead, expression unreadable, but his jaw was set so tightly it could crack. The glint of the engagement ring on his finger caught the light for one brief second before his hand slipped it into his coat pocket. This was supposed to be a promotional moment, a joyful announcement. His upcoming wedding had dominated headlines for weeks, and now, in an exclusive sit-down, Taehyung had chosen to finally speak about love, commitment, and moving forward. But no one in the room expected that name to be uttered. Jungkook. It wasn't forbidden, not officially, just unspoken, because everyone knew the weight it carried. And now, the question hung in the air like smoke after a fire. Taehyung stood up, adjusted the sleeves of his navy silk suit, and nodded politely to no one in particular. "Thank you," he said with the stiffness of someone reciting a line from a dream they didn't want to wake up from. He walked off the set, his shoes echoing against the studio floor with every step, a sound more deafening than anything he had said. The host turned pale, the cameras slowly zoomed out. The moment was over. Or rather, it had just begun. Backstage, chaos erupted. Managers whispered in frenzied Korean into headsets, trying to salvage what could be salvaged. The producers stared at one another. Was this real? Would it go viral? Was it planned? But the real story wasn't just about the walk-off. It was about why that question broke him. Because a week before the interview, Taehyung had been seen alone at a cafe he and Jungkook used to frequent. No entourage, no fiancé, just him, nursing a black coffee he never used to like. The barista, a longtime BTS fan, said he looked like he hadn't slept in days. His fingers kept tapping the table, she'd whispered on a fan forum, like he was waiting for someone who never came. People had been speculating. Some called it wedding nerves. Others said it was guilt. But few knew the truth behind the silence between Taehyung and Jungkook. A silence that wasn't born out of a single fight, but years of buried emotions, misread signs, moments of almosts and what-ifs. In private, Taehyung had rehearsed answers to that question 100 times. "Jungkook and I are still close. Of course he's invited. Let's not focus on who's coming, let's focus on love." But none of them felt honest, and Taehyung, for all his ability to perform on stage, couldn't lie with a straight face, not about this. The night before the interview, he'd found the old letter again, the one Jungkook had written 3 years ago and never sent. It was tucked between the pages of a photo book, still folded the same way. His name written across the front in Jungkook's rushed, emotional scrawl. He hadn't opened it. Not fully, just glimpsed the first line. "I'm sorry I waited until now to say this." He had put the letter back, left it unread, because if he read it, something inside him might break, and there was too much already broken between them. The next morning, his stylist asked if he wanted to wear a silver pin Jungkook had once gifted him, a minimalist V-shaped brooch. He said no. She didn't ask why. Back at the studio, as Taehyung exited through the loading dock to avoid paparazzi, his phone buzzed once. He didn't check it, but the screen lit up just enough for the driver beside him to see one word flash before it disappeared. "Why?" From Jungkook. He exhaled slowly, leaning back against the seat, letting the silence fill him. This wasn't just about a wedding. It was about what had never been said and what could no longer be fixed. Inside the studio, the host was trying to wrap things up with grace, but the question had already gone viral. The clip had been clipped, shared, and captioned by ARMY within minutes. Taehyung ends interview when asked about Jungkook. "Read one tweet," another said. You could see the pain in his eyes before he stood up. Comment sections burned with theories. "They're not talking anymore. Jungkook must have declined the invite. Did something happen between them? Taekook is not just a ship, it's a shipwreck." Later that evening, Taehyung posted a single photo on Instagram. A blurry black and white image of a dim hallway. No caption, no tags. But fans recognized the setting. It was from the backstage area of their 2020 concert, the same one where Taehyung and Jungkook had been caught in a candid, laughing together in the corridor, unaware of the camera. The contrast was too much. Across town, Jungkook sat in his studio. He had watched the clip in real time. Not because he wanted to, but because someone had sent it before he could avoid it. He replayed it 3 times, each time pausing at the exact frame where Taehyung's face fell before standing up. He closed his laptop. Then, after a long pause, he finally unfolded the draft of the message he'd been writing for days. It read, "I saw what happened. I'm not angry. I'm just sorry it still hurts. I'm sorry it's become this." He didn't hit send. He stared at the blinking cursor, then backspaced the entire thing. That night, neither of them slept. And when the sun rose the next morning, the world had already moved on to the next trending topic, but they hadn't. Because some questions don't need answers. They just need silence. And sometimes, shutting down is the only way to avoid falling apart. The studio still buzzed with leftover static even after Taehyung walked out. Technicians whispered while unplugging equipment, as if afraid to disturb the tension that still clung to the air like invisible smoke. The director stood frozen near the monitor, his eyes glued to the playback of the moment Taehyung had removed his mic. The sound of the clip repeated faintly through the speakers, looping his final words, "I think we're done here." Over and over, each repetition sharper than the last. In the corner of the dressing room, Taehyung sat hunched forward on the leather couch, elbows on his knees, eyes trained on the floor like it held the answers he couldn't find. His assistant hovered near the mirror, holding a water bottle that had long since gone warm, unsure whether to speak. He didn't. Taehyung's fingers pressed into his temples, a silent war waging behind closed eyes. Thoughts spiraling like a tornado made of memories he wished he could silence. He could still hear it. That name, Jungkook. 3 syllables that used to taste like laughter and now burned like regret. When the assistant finally dared to speak, his voice cracked from hesitation. "Hyung, do you want to go home?" Taehyung didn't answer at first. He lifted his head slowly, looked at his own reflection in the vanity mirror, and gave a hollow smile. "Home?" he echoed, as if trying to recall what that even meant anymore. "Do I still have one?" He stood, straightened the creases on his coat, and brushed past the assistant gently, as though apologizing for the weight of his silence. Outside, the streetlights flickered through the tinted window of the black van waiting for him. Seoul's night felt colder than usual. Or maybe he was just too hollow to feel anything at all. The city moved on without him, neon signs blinking, couples laughing on sidewalks, restaurants glowing with warmth he couldn't enter. His phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't Jungkook. It was his manager. A simple message. "PR damage control underway. Please no post tonight." He locked the screen without replying. His hand trembled just enough that he noticed. That simple question, it shouldn't have been enough to unravel him. But it had. And now, he couldn't stop reliving it. The way his chest clenched, the dryness of his mouth, the sound of Jungkook's name echoing through his ribs like a bullet ricocheting inside a cave. The van pulled up to his apartment. The same building he had moved into after the group's hiatus began. The same place he thought would feel like a new start. But as he walked into the familiar lobby, nodding politely to the concierge who didn't dare speak after recognizing the tension in his eyes, Taehyung realized something painfully clear. It wasn't the question that hurt. It was the fact that he didn't have an answer. Upstairs, in the stillness of his living room, he let himself collapse onto the couch, tie loosened, fingers shaking. A faint whiff of Jungkook's cologne still clung to the old scarf on the coat rack. It had been there for months, untouched, a ghost of a time when they used to visit each other without planning. When everything was simple, when feelings didn't need labels, and the word invited didn't feel like an accusation. He picked up the scarf, held it for a second, then quickly tossed it aside as if it had burned him. On his dining table, the wedding invite proofs were still spread out calligraphy samples, paper textures, gold-trimmed edges that now felt too extravagant. He stared at the guest list again. Jungkook's name wasn't there. It never had been. Not because he wanted to exclude him, but because including him meant opening a door to 1,000 buried emotions he wasn't ready to face. Still, leaving the name out had felt like cutting off his own hand. He closed the folder slowly and leaned back, the weight of it all pressing into his chest. Across the city, Jungkook stood in his own studio, lights dim, guitar resting unused in the corner. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was accusing. He'd seen the clip too many times now, not just from his own screen, but through texts sent by members, friends, even fans. "Are you okay? Did you know?" He looked devastated. But Jungkook didn't want their sympathy. What he needed was something no one could give. An explanation. He had tried over and over to be understanding, to give Taehyung the space he thought he needed. But space had become distance, and distance had turned into silence, and silence had become a wall so high, neither of them knew how to climb it anymore. He had drafted a message again. This time it was shorter. "Can we talk?" Simple, soft, vulnerable. He didn't send it. He couldn't. Not after what had happened on national television. Not when Taehyung had looked like that, broken, bitter, and lost. It wasn't just pain anymore. It was something heavier, something unspoken. The next morning, tabloids exploded. Every platform, every news outlet, every trending topic was some variation of Taehyung walks out over Jungkook question. BTS rift confirmed? No invitation for Jungkook? Even ARMY began taking sides. Fan accounts dug up every old video, every cryptic caption, every moment where one looked at the other too long or didn't look at all. One video in particular surfaced a backstage clip from their last world tour, where Taehyung had paused before entering stage left, and Jungkook had gently touched his back and whispered something. The audio was muffled, but lip readers claimed he said, "Don't forget I'm here." The comment sections flooded with heartbreak. People didn't need subtitles for that kind of pain. Meanwhile, Taehyung sat in his apartment with the curtains drawn, the world outside blurred by frost and regret. His fiancée had called. Twice. He hadn't answered. It wasn't that he didn't care. It was just... She didn't ask about Jungkook, and he couldn't trust anyone who didn't understand how much that mattered. He stared at the blank text message screen again, thumb hovering over the keyboard, then typing something without thinking. I didn't know how to answer it. Then he backspaced all of it. He shut the phone off, because he still didn't know what he wanted to say. That night, they both found themselves staring at the same sky from different rooftops. Jungkook on the building near his studio, hoodie pulled tight, breath forming clouds. Taehyung on his balcony, cigarette forgotten between his fingers, eyes glassy from a mixture of cold and memory. Somewhere between them, a million things remained unsaid. But the loudest of all was the one question neither could answer, not truthfully. Are you still coming? And maybe that was the problem. Invitations could be printed, sent, ignored, but the real invitation, the one they both needed, was the courage to speak again. Not for the cameras, not for the fans, not for closure, but because some wounds didn't heal in silence. They healed in honesty, and both of them were still bleeding. Even if the world couldn't see it, even if they smiled in every other photo, even if the wedding bells did eventually ring, and Jungkook wasn't there to hear them. The ringing in Taehyung's ears didn't stop, not even after the city lights dimmed and the internet's flames began to flicker into embers. For hours, he'd sat on the cold marble floor of his living room, arms wrapped loosely around his knees, staring at nothing. The world outside moved forward, cars passed, elevators whirred. Night slowly bled into morning, but he stayed still, as if frozen in a memory too heavy to rise from. The silence inside the apartment was deafening, and yet, it was safer than the chaos outside. His fiancée had texted again. Let's talk today. I'm here when you're ready. Sweet, gentle, understanding. But her kindness felt like a mirror he didn't want to look into, because it only reflected how divided he truly was. She loved him, and he knew he loved her, but some love carried no echoes. With her, everything was warm, stable, like a harbor after a storm. But Jungkook was the storm itself, always had been. The unpredictable laughter, the sharp eyes that read him too well, the silence that often said more than his words. Every time he thought he'd buried those feelings, they rose again in a moment, as if summoned by something as simple as a name. And now the whole world knew he couldn't even say that name without falling apart. He dragged himself to the bathroom, splashing water over his face, eyes bloodshot and rimmed with regret. He caught his own reflection in the mirror, almost startled by how hollow he looked. Not broken exactly, but emptied, as though he'd poured every version of himself into the wrong containers, and now nothing fit right anymore. He picked up the engagement ring from the counter, turning it in his fingers, the metal cold against his skin. Would she notice if he took a few days away? Would it make a difference? Would anything? Somewhere on the other side of the city, Jungkook couldn't sleep. He sat on the edge of his bed, strumming his guitar with no particular melody, fingers restless, his mind louder than the strings. The silence in his apartment was sharp too, but his was filled with questions. The kind that looped in your mind at 3 a.m. and made you want to scream into pillows. Why hadn't Taehyung just said yes? Or no? Why walk away like that so publicly, so definitively? It wasn't just the absence of an invitation that stung. It was the implication behind the silence. That maybe he didn't matter anymore. That maybe they were now just two men who used to laugh in dressing rooms, share hotel rooms in Tokyo, whisper lyrics into the dark while the others slept. Maybe that time had expired, and no one had bothered to tell him. The worst part wasn't the pain. Jungkook could handle pain. He trained himself to. The worst part was not knowing what he meant to Taehyung now. If anything, he thought back to the last time they'd really talked. Not surface level. Not polite. Really talked. It had been during rehearsals for their last group performance, long after the stylists had left and the lights were off. They had sat on the floor, backs to the wall, breathing the same tired air. Taehyung had looked at him, voice hoarse, and said, "What if we're not done but we can't keep going either?" Jungkook had laughed then, thinking it was just about the group. But now he wasn't so sure. He opened his phone, stared at his gallery. There were hundreds of pictures, some posted, some never meant to be. One caught his attention, a blurry shot of Taehyung laughing, hand half covering his mouth, eyes squinted in that way that meant it was real. Jungkook had taken it in secret, years ago, while they waited for the van in the freezing cold. He could almost hear the moment again. "Delete that," Taehyung had teased, shivering but smiling anyway. Jungkook never did. And now, as he stared at the image, he wondered if it was foolish to keep things that hurt. He turned the screen off. Somewhere deep in his heart, he still believed in moments that maybe, given the right one, they could talk again. Honestly, like they used to. But moments like that didn't just appear. Sometimes they had to be made. The next morning, Taehyung packed a small bag. No stylists, no managers, no PR team, just him. A black cap pulled low over his eyes, and sunglasses to hide the fatigue no amount of rest could cure. He sent one message before leaving. "I need a few days. Don't cancel anything. Just cover for me." His team didn't ask questions. They were used to this kind of silence from him. Silence that meant he needed to feel like a human again, not a brand. The car took him out of the city, up into the mountains where the sky felt closer and the air didn't smell like anxiety. He checked into a small inn, one with no Wi-Fi, no reporters, no reminders. He didn't unpack. He just collapsed onto the bed and stared at the wooden beams above, letting himself disappear into the quiet. But peace didn't come, because peace had a name. And it was the one he still couldn't say out loud. The next day, as frost coated the windows of the inn, a message finally came through on the old landline phone the front desk had reluctantly connected to his room. A voice he hadn't heard in weeks. Hesitant. "It's Jungkook. Look, I don't know where you are, and I'm not even sure why I'm calling this number. I saw you leave. I saw your face, and I need you to know I'm not angry. I just want to understand. Did I do something? Or was I just never part of your future to begin with?" Taehyung didn't answer the phone, but he sat there, hand on the receiver, heart pounding against ribs like it wanted to escape. Every part of him screamed to pick it up, but fear whispered louder. What if he said the wrong thing again? What if it made everything worse? The line went silent, then clicked off. Jungkook hung up without waiting. Taehyung lowered his head. There were no tears. Just this aching hollowness that made even breathing feel like an effort. He didn't know what to say, because everything inside him was tangled in guilt and confusion, and this unbearable yearning for a version of their story that hadn't ended like this. That night, he wrote a letter. Not a text, not a message, a real letter. Pen and paper. His handwriting shaky but deliberate. He wrote everything. The truth, the memories, the fear. I didn't invite you, he wrote, because I knew if I saw you walk through that door, I wouldn't be able to go through with it. Not because I don't love her, but because part of me is still yours, and I'm tired of pretending it isn't. He didn't sign it. Didn't know how. Just folded it and placed it on the small wooden table beside the bed. He didn't know if he'd send it or burn it, but for now, it existed. For now, that was enough. And far away, back in Seoul, Jungkook sat beside his own window, watching snow begin to fall, wondering if silence would be the only language they ever truly shared again. The snow outside Jungkook's apartment thickened, slow and deliberate, like time was purposely moving at half speed. Each flake carried weight, not in mass, but in memory. He watched them fall, not blinking, eyes dry but heavy. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he wondered whether Taehyung was seeing the same sky. Whether the mountains surrounding him were coated white now too. Silent and untouched, like a canvas waiting to be ruined by confession. Jungkook hadn't planned on calling. It had been impulse, restless fingers, a heart swollen with unsaid things. The ache of watching someone walk away from a question like it was a wound. He knew it wouldn't fix anything, but hearing the ring on the other end made him feel close again. Just for a moment. Like breathing through the same moment even if miles apart. But the silence that answered him felt final. He didn't blame him. Not really. He just hated that it had come to this cold war where no one declared anything, and yet both sides lived in ruins. Days passed. Headlines shifted. The scandal cooled, but it never quite died. Taehyung's PR team released a soft statement. He appreciates everyone's support and hopes for understanding during this personal time. It said nothing. It was meant to, but fans weren't stupid. They read between the spaces. Between Taehyung's avoidance and Jungkook's absence. One fan video titled "The Look That Broke Him" racked up over 2 million views in 2 days. An edit of Taehyung's face changing right before he stood up and walked off set. Slowed down, color corrected, overlaid with a piano instrumental. The internet turned heartbreak into art. Jungkook tried not to watch it. He failed. The freeze frame of Taehyung's eyes, guarded, glassy, lost, haunted him more than anything else. Not because he saw hurt, but because he saw himself reflected back in it. Meanwhile, the letter Taehyung wrote remained untouched, folded and smoothed at the edges from where his fingers kept grazing it, over and over, like muscle memory. He hadn't burned it. He hadn't mailed it. He just kept rereading it silently, as if the words on the page could bleed into him and absolve him of the burden of speaking them aloud. Every time he reached the line about the door, the one where he admitted he couldn't watch Jungkook walk through it, his throat closed. He hadn't lied. That was the most painful part. He hadn't lied at all. If Jungkook had walked into that wedding venue, everything in him would have unraveled. And he'd known that. He'd known it with the same clarity you know a flame will burn your skin. And still you reach for it, hoping it feels like warmth instead. One morning, while the mist still clung to the pine trees outside his window, Taehyung stepped out into the snow barefoot. He didn't know why. Maybe to feel something sharp. Maybe to punish himself with cold. Maybe because he remembered a night when he and Jungkook were drunk off laughter and snowflakes, and Jungkook dared him to race through the snow in nothing but socks. That night, they'd collapsed together in a giggling heap against the car, breathless and flushed, whispering things neither could repeat in daylight. It had meant everything then. It meant more now, in its absence.
The cold stung. He didn't move. Somewhere down the hill, a delivery car crawled up the icy road. He didn't expect anything. So when the innkeeper knocked on his door an hour later and handed him a package with a confused expression, Taehyung felt his chest tight. It was small. No note, no return address. But he recognized the handwriting. The label simply read, "For when you can't speak." He opened it with shaking hands. Inside was a music box. Plain, wooden, hand-carved. He wound it carefully, hard in his throat. The melody was immediate, familiar. A short instrumental version of a song they wrote together in 2020 but never released. Jungkook's voice wasn't there, but it didn't need to be. The melody was him, every note chosen like a memory. Taehyung sat with it for a long time, the soft tune filling the room like a ghost returned to say goodbye. He didn't cry. He couldn't. The grief was deeper than that. It lived in his bones. That night he wrote again. This time in a notebook he hadn't touched in months. Words poured faster than his hand could keep up. He didn't edit, didn't cross anything out, just let it spill. I think we both knew it couldn't last, not because it wasn't real, but because we were too real for the world to handle, too loud in a silence no one else heard. I wanted to love you quietly, but I think we burned too brightly to ever go unnoticed. When he finished, he closed the notebook, placed it next to the music box, and fell asleep with the melody still humming in the back of his mind. 2 days later, Taehyung returned to Seoul. No one knew. He wore a mask, kept his hood up, slipped past cameras and questions. He didn't go home. He went straight to the studio where Jungkook recorded, not because he planned to speak, but because he needed to feel what it meant to be near him again. Just once. He sat outside in the stairwell for an hour, heart hammering. Then the door opened. Jungkook stepped out, hoodie damp from sweat, earbuds in, unaware, until he stopped. Froze, their eyes met, time stilled, neither moved, neither smiled. It was Taehyung who spoke first. "Hi," just that, soft, hesitant. Jungkook nodded. "Hi." The weight of everything they hadn't said hovered between them. Jungkook took a step closer. "Did you get it?" Taehyung nodded. "I did." "Did you listen?" "Twice." "Did it say enough?" "Almost." A silence again, but this one was different, gentle, forgiving. Jungkook's voice trembled. "Why didn't you invite me?" Taehyung looked down, then met his eyes again. "Because I knew if I saw you sitting there, even from across the aisle, I'd forget who I was supposed to be walking toward." Jungkook blinked, throat tight. "And now, Taehyung swallowed hard, the words almost choking him. "Now I don't know who I'm walking away from anymore." Jungkook took another step. The distance between them was so small now, a whisper could have crossed it. "Then don't." The world fell away. No cameras, no fans, no expectations, just them, standing in a hallway that had seen too many versions of who they used to be. Taehyung's voice cracked. "It's too late." Jungkook shook his head. "It's only too late if we stop choosing each other." For the first time in months, Taehyung allowed himself to breathe. And with that breath came tears, not loud, not dramatic. Just quiet streaks down his cheek, as if his body had finally stopped holding them in. Jungkook stepped forward, gently brushing his thumb across Taehyung's cheek. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't reunion. It was something softer. A truce between hearts too bruised to fight anymore. No promises were made. No decisions declared. But in that hallway beneath flickering studio lights, two men stood still in the ruins of something beautiful and chose silently to remain. Not because the world needed it. Because they did. Because even in silence, some bonds speak louder than words. The hallway air was still heavy with everything unspoken, yet neither of them moved. The silence wasn't awkward. It was reverent, fragile, like both knew that one wrong word could break whatever thread had just been stitched between them. Taehyung's breath came out in a slow exhale, his shoulders finally relaxing after what felt like months of armor. He blinked, eyes still glassy, not from weakness but from finally letting go. Jungkook watched him carefully, not daring to touch again, not yet. The space between them was sacred, not because it was empty, but because it was filled with the kind of history that didn't require explanation. It was filled with shared stages, whispered confessions in hotel hallways, glances caught in dressing room mirrors, and that one night in Busan when neither of them had said it out loud, but both had known they weren't just bandmates anymore. Jungkook's voice, when he spoke again, was barely audible. "I never stopped waiting." Taehyung nodded slowly, lips parting like he wanted to speak, but nothing came. He didn't need to say it. Jungkook could see it in his eyes, that same flicker of guilt, of love, of everything they had buried and called friendship because the truth had been too dangerous. Taehyung finally whispered, "You don't know what it cost me." Jungkook didn't flinch. "Then tell me." There was a pause that stretched too long. But then Taehyung closed his eyes, and when he opened them, he wasn't hiding anymore. "The night I got engaged, I almost called you." The words hung in the air like frost. Jungkook's brows furrowed, his mouth parting in surprise, but he didn't interrupt. "I stood in the hotel bathroom for almost an hour," Taehyung continued, voice raw now, phone in hand, your name on the screen, "but I couldn't do it. Because I knew if I heard your voice, I wouldn't go back out there. I wouldn't say yes. I wouldn't walk into that room again." Jungkook's jaw clenched, not in anger but in restraint, the weight of what could have been settled in his chest like a brick. He nodded slowly, the pain visible in his posture. "And now you're here," he said softly. "Now I'm here," Taehyung echoed, "and I don't know what that means." They stood like that for another beat, and then Jungkook stepped to the side, motioning to the studio door behind him. "Come in, just sit. You don't have to say anything." Taehyung hesitated only for a moment before following. The door clicked shut behind them, muting the world outside. The studio was warm, dimly lit, and smelled faintly of cedarwood and coffee. Instruments were scattered around, notebooks half open on the console, a mug still steaming beside the keyboard. Jungkook moved around the space like it was his skin, his home. He handed Taehyung the mug, now offering comfort in silence the way he always had, with gestures, with presence, with his quiet consistency. Taehyung took it, fingers brushing Jungkook. No spark, no jolt, just familiarity. Jungkook settled into the chair beside him, fingers unconsciously drumming a rhythm on his thigh. "I've been writing," he said. "Nothing special, just thoughts." Taehyung looked around at the walls filled with scribbled lyrics and recordings. "They're always special when they come from you." Jungkook turned his head slowly, studying him. "Do you mean that?" Taehyung nodded. "I never stopped meaning it." The silence returned, but this time it pulsed, alive. Taehyung took a breath, setting the mug down. "When we first started this, whatever this was, I didn't know how deep I was falling. I thought I was just close to you because we understood each other. Because we were always beside each other, on flights, on stages, in rooms full of strangers. But then one day, it hurt when you weren't looking at me the way you used to, and I hated that it mattered so much." Jungkook didn't speak, but his hands had stilled completely now, his gaze unblinking. "And then the world started watching," Taehyung continued, "and suddenly every look, every smile was dissected. We became someone else's fantasy, and I didn't know how to keep something real in a place where everything had to be performed." He paused, shaking his head. "So I chose safe. I chose something I thought would protect me, but I keep waking up thinking of you." Jungkook's voice cracked when he finally spoke. "I would have stayed hidden, I would have kept us secret if it meant you didn't have to choose between me and peace." "I know," Taehyung said, voice almost breaking, "and that's what made it worse. You never asked for more, you just waited, and I couldn't even give you that." The air shifted then, heavier, denser. Jungkook stood slowly, walking over to the keyboard. He pressed a few keys, then played a soft progression, gentle, haunting. Taehyung watched as his hands moved instinctively, as if his pain had been waiting for music to shape it. Then Jungkook began to sing. Not loud, not polished, but pure, just a few lines, raw, the kind of sound that only came from truth. Taehyung listened, frozen. As his own memories bled into the notes, the song wasn't about blame, it wasn't about regret, it was about them. About two souls trying to hold on in a world that kept tearing at the threads. When Jungkook finished, he didn't look up. He stayed bent over the keys, fingers trembling slightly. "I wrote that the night you walked out of the interview," he said. Taehyung couldn't stop the tear that slipped down his cheek. "Why didn't you send it?" "Because I wanted you to hear it first." They didn't speak again for a long time, just sat there in the dim light, surrounded by silence and song. When Taehyung finally stood, he walked over and placed his hand over Jungkook's on the keyboard. "Thank you," he said, "for never letting go of the parts of us I was too afraid to hold." Jungkook looked up then, and in his eyes there was no anger, just something quieter, sadder, but still there. Taehyung leaned down, forehead resting against Jungkook, their breath sinking, the world shrinking until only the hum of the studio existed. "I don't know what happens next," Taehyung whispered. "I don't either," Jungkook replied, "but I'm tired of pretending I don't miss you. I'm tired of pretending I ever stopped loving you." The confession settled between them like the final note of a song, soft, unmistakable, whole. Neither of them smiled, they didn't need to. Because sometimes in the quiet, love speaks loudest. And tonight, for the first time in what felt like forever, they let it. The hours slipped by unnoticed, the low hum of the studio equipment the only sound that lingered between them. Taehyung remained still, forehead resting gently against Jungkook. Neither of them speaking because there was nothing left to prove. They had laid their truths bare, stripped down every excuse and misdirection until only raw vulnerability remained. Jungkook's hand, still beneath Taehyung's, curled slightly, fingers tracing slow, uncertain patterns along his knuckles, and in that motion was the echo of 1,000 moments long buried but never forgotten. The air smelled of old wood, lingering coffee, and that particular warmth only found in spaces where honesty had finally broken through the silence. When they finally moved, it wasn't dramatic. No grand declarations, no tearful embraces. Just the quiet, heavy way Taehyung exhaled and pulled away slowly, like he was afraid any sudden movement would crack the fragile balance they had rediscovered. Jungkook looked up, and their eyes met again, not with questions this time but with understanding. "I'm not asking you to leave her," Jungkook said finally, voice low and steady, as though he'd rehearsed it in his head 100 times but still felt the weight of saying it out loud. Taehyung closed his eyes briefly, nodding, though his throat tightened. "I know. But I needed you to know I was never standing in your way." "You weren't," Taehyung whispered, the ache in his voice undeniable. "You were the only one who made me want to stay." That silence returned, the kind that held years inside it. Jungkook shifted back toward the keyboard and played a single note just once, the sound stretching long and unresolved. "I wrote another song," he said. "Different from the one I played you. It's not finished, because I didn't know how it ended. Still don't." Taehyung's gaze softened. "Will you play it for me anyway?" Jungkook hesitated, then nodded. His fingers moved more cautiously this time, slower, like every chord was a breath, every progression a heartbeat. The melody was soft, almost mournful, but there was hope tucked between the notes, like a sunrise behind rain-soaked clouds. Taehyung sat beside him, the sound washing over him like water over cracked earth. He didn't speak. He just listened. And when Jungkook's voice finally joined the piano, it didn't rise like a performance. It trembled like a confession, each lyric wrapped in something deeper than pain or longing. It was a song about waiting, about the spaces between words, about love that doesn't disappear even when buried beneath years of trying to forget. When the last note faded, Taehyung found himself blinking fast, fighting the sudden burn behind his eyes. "It's beautiful," he said, his voice a whisper. Jungkook didn't look at him. "It's yours." The weight of those words settled in Taehyung's chest like gravity. "I don't deserve that." Jungkook finally met his eyes. "You don't get to decide what I give." There was no anger in his voice, only quiet conviction, the kind that came from having loved someone too long to hate them now. Taehyung didn't answer. He just stood slowly and walked toward the far wall where old photos were pinned haphazardly. Moments from tour, studio sessions, birthdays, quiet snapshots taken when no one was looking. His eyes landed on one in particular. It was the two of them backstage, both laughing. One of Jungkook's arms slung lazily over Taehyung's shoulder while the other hand held a microphone. The lighting was poor, the shot a little blurry, but the happiness in their expressions was undeniable. He reached up and touched the corner of the photo, not lifting it, just pressing his fingertips lightly against the memory. "Do you think we were ever wrong?" he asked, not turning around. Jungkook's reply was quiet but immediate. "No, I think we were just afraid." Taehyung closed his eyes, remembering the nights they'd spent staring at the ceiling, bodies inches apart but hearts guarded by invisible walls. He remembered the time he almost kissed him in the hallway of a hotel in Paris, how Jungkook had looked at him and opened his mouth like he was going to say something, and then didn't. He remembered the way they clung to each other in the dressing room after that one performance when the crowd wouldn't stop chanting their names together, and it felt like the universe was daring them to admit the truth. He turned around finally, and this time his voice was steady. "If I called off the wedding." Jungkook's heart stumbled in his chest, but he didn't move. "Taehyung," he said carefully, "don't say things you do mean." "I mean them," he replied, taking a step closer. "I've meant them for years, I just didn't know how to say them out loud." Jungkook stood, the space between them shrinking once again, but this time it buzzed with something electric. "You're scared," Jungkook said. "So am I, but if you do this, if you walk away from her, you have to do it for you, not for me, not for us." "What if it's the same thing?" "It's not." His voice was firm now. "Because if you leave her and this falls apart, I don't want you to resent me for it. I could never resent you." "You don't know that." Taehyung stopped. Silence again, heavy. Then he exhaled. "You're right, but I do know one thing. I'm tired of waking up pretending. I'm tired of choosing what looks good over what feels real. And if all I ever have is this moment with you, this room, this song, this quiet, I want it to be honest." Jungkook's walls cracked then. He didn't cry, but he stepped forward and pulled Taehyung into him, arms wrapping around him like he was afraid he'd disappear. Taehyung folded instantly into the embrace, face buried in Jungkook's neck. the scent of him triggering 1,000 memories all at once. They stood like that for what felt like forever, swaying slightly, the only rhythm between them the soft sound of their breathing sinking again after all this time. When they finally pulled back, Jungkook looked into his eyes and asked, "What happens next?" Taehyung smiled sadly. "I don't know, but I'm not running anymore. Then we'll figure it out together." "Together," Taehyung echoed. The next few days unfolded quietly. Taehyung didn't make a public statement. He didn't post. He didn't go back to the PR meetings or the wedding planners or the schedules waiting in his inbox. Instead, he sat in the studio with Jungkook, recording pieces of the songs they once abandoned. They ordered food at odd hours, laughed at nothing, took walks late at night with masks and hoodies, blending into the quiet shadows of the city like ghosts given one more chance to live. He called his fiancée. They spoke gently, honestly. There were no accusations, only sadness. She had known. She had seen it in his eyes. She cried, but not because he'd left, because he had waited so long to tell the truth. Taehyung promised to always be grateful for her, and she told him, voice trembling, that she hoped he'd finally be happy. News broke days later. No press conference, just a line in a quiet article. Taehyung's wedding has been postponed indefinitely. The fandom exploded again. Theories multiplied. Some cursed him. Some defended him. But the loudest voices were silent this time, because something in the air had shifted. Something about the way Jungkook smiled in his latest live stream. The softness in Taehyung's eyes when a fan asked about future projects. No one confirmed anything. But maybe they didn't need to. Because love, when it's real, doesn't always need to be seen. Sometimes it's just heard in the quiet between two notes of a song unfinished, in the silence between two breaths, in the space between hearts that never really stopped beating for each other. And somewhere, deep in a studio where time stood still, two voices finally sang together again. Not for the world, just for them. The days that followed blurred into each other, not because they lacked meaning, but because, for the first time in what felt like years, Taehyung and Jungkook were allowed to simply exist in the same space without pretending they didn't crave it. The studio became their sanctuary, a place where sound covered silence, where music filled the void between apologies and the vulnerability neither had the courage to name outside of lyrics. Some mornings, Taehyung would wake on the small couch in the corner, blankets uneven, his arm flung over his eyes to block the morning light filtering through the blinds, and Jungkook would already be hunched over the console, headphones on, lost in layers of melodies. He would always turn when he heard Taehyung stir, offering a soft, sleepy smile that carried more affection than any good morning ever could. Taehyung would nod, and in that unspoken exchange they found safety, not in words but in presence. Neither of them rushed it. Whatever was growing between them again, it wasn't fragile. It had been shattered and rebuilt too many times to be anything less than durable. But it was cautious, like a song sung in falsetto where every breath mattered. One night, the city roared with its usual chaos outside, but inside the studio, the world had narrowed to a quiet hush. Jungkook sat on the floor, legs crossed, strumming a melody on a worn acoustic guitar while Taehyung sat beside him, notebook open, a pen held loosely between his fingers as he scribbled lines, crossing them out, rewriting them, pausing mid-thought to hum softly, eyes glazed in memory. The song wasn't about love, not directly. It was about longing, about the years spent orbiting each other, about the way silence could be louder than betrayal, about the ache of almosts and the burn of never quite enough. "Can I read something to you?" Taehyung asked suddenly, his voice low, hesitant. Jungkook looked up, nodding. Taehyung flipped a few pages back and cleared his throat. "There's this line I wrote last night, it's kind of messy." Jungkook waited. Taehyung inhaled shakily and read, "You were the storm I kept running into, hopping lightning would forget to strike." The room stilled. Jungkook didn't speak right away. He set the guitar down gently and turned to face him completely. "That's not messy," he said. "That's the most honest thing you've written." Taehyung looked down, biting the inside of his cheek. "It scared me to admit it." "It scares me too," Jungkook said quietly. "But I'd rather be afraid together than alone in silence again." In that moment, something broke again, but not in pain. It broke in surrender, and it rebuilt itself in trust. Taehyung leaned his head against Jungkook's shoulder, his eyes fluttering shut, and Jungkook didn't move. His hand found Taehyung's without thinking, fingers sliding between his, and they sat like that for what felt like forever. No cameras, no scripts, just two hearts that had refused to forget each other. Outside the studio, the world didn't stop. Rumors kept circulating. Speculations, fan threads, blurry photos of them spotted entering the same building late at night, but neither of them addressed it. For once, the silence wasn't avoidance, it was protection. It was theirs, not a performance, not a brand, just them. One evening, as rain drizzled against the windows and thunder rolled distantly, Jungkook played the first few notes of the song they had been working on for weeks. It had no title yet, no fixed arrangement, but the melody had solidified into something aching and full. Taehyung stepped up to the mic, headphones on, lips parting as he prepared to sing the lines they'd written together. Jungkook watched from the soundboard, heart beating in time with every syllable. Taehyung's voice poured through the speakers, warm and raw and trembling in all the right places, like he wasn't singing to a mic but straight into Jungkook's chest. When the final chorus faded, Jungkook didn't press stop immediately. He let the silence play out, let the air between them fill with the echo of what had just passed between them. Taehyung slowly removed the headphones and looked at him through the glass. They didn't need to speak. They both knew it. They had found something again. Not the past, not what they once were, but something new, something truer. That night they didn't go home. They curled up on the floor beneath a tangle of blankets and laughter, a bottle of wine half finished, the soft hum of old songs playing from Jungkook's phone. They talked in half sentences, revisiting old memories like postcards from a life they'd almost lost. Jungkook traced circles on Taehyung's wrist as he spoke, and Taehyung kept glancing at his lips between sentences like the pull was magnetic. At some point, their words dwindled into soft silence. Jungkook's hand slid behind Taehyung's neck and pulled him closer. The kiss was slow, exploratory, cautious, not because they were unsure, but because they didn't want to rush through something they had waited years to feel again. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't a promise. It was an answer to every question they hadn't been brave enough to ask before. When morning light crept into the studio, golden and quiet, Taehyung stirred first, eyes blinking open to find Jungkook's arm draped around his waist, face pressed into the curve of his shoulder. For a second he didn't move. He just watched him, breathing slow and steady, peace etched into every line of his face. He reached up and brushed a strand of hair from Jungkook's forehead and whispered, "I missed you." Jungkook's eyes fluttered open and he smiled, sleepy and soft. "You found me," he murmured. "You always find me." In the weeks that followed, they didn't label it. They didn't hide it either. They just were together, creating, healing, laughing in ways they hadn't in years. The tension in Taehyung's shoulders lifted slowly. He smiled more, slept better, called his mother and told her honestly that the wedding was off, and no, he wasn't broken. He was finding himself again. Jungkook called his brother and finally told him why he'd been silent for months. They began to live again, not in secret, not in fear, but in the quiet joy of knowing they had each other. When the new song finally released, it didn't chart immediately. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't promoted, but the ones who listened heard everything. The lyrics didn't mention names, but they didn't need to. Fans cried in comment sections. Others posted theories, but most just said the same thing: it feels like coming home. And maybe that was the point, because love like theirs wasn't made for headlines. It was made for late nights and whispered songs, for the space between chords and the silence after goodbyes. It was made to survive storms. And now, at last, it had. Taehyung and Jungkook stood side by side again, not because the world wanted them to, but because they chose to. Because after everything, after all the silence, the pain, the hesitation, they had finally found the courage to say what needed to be said. Not in interviews, not on stage, but in the soft language of love they had taught each other through every look, every lyric, every unfinished sentence that now no longer needed finishing. They were no longer pretending. They were no longer waiting. They were simply and finally together. The days stretched into weeks, but in that quiet corner of the city tucked away inside the studio, time moved differently. The world outside could spin faster, louder, more demanding with its flashing cameras and speculative voices. But within these walls, Taehyung and Jungkook had carved out a space where they could breathe as themselves. No masks, no choreography, no expectations. The music became their language again, the safe bridge between memories and the unfolding present. Their voices blended not only in harmonies, but in the small, domestic rituals that stitched their time together. One of them humming softly while brewing coffee, the other scribbling lyrics on napkins, only to laugh and toss them away when the words felt too cheesy. It wasn't always perfect. There were moments where their silences grew thick, where the weight of all they hadn't addressed still tugged at the edges. Sometimes Jungkook would fall quiet for hours, lost in thought, eyes distant even while sitting next to Taehyung. Sometimes Taehyung would wake in the middle of the night and lie still, heart racing, wondering if any of this was real or just a fragile detour before reality swallowed them again. But they had promised no more pretending. And so they talked, really talked. In the late hours when the city slept, they lay side by side under studio blankets, voices low and honest, finally giving language to the heartbreak they had carried alone for too long. One night after they had finished tracking vocals on the second song of their new project, Taehyung stayed behind while Jungkook went out to pick up food. The room was quiet, still warm from their laughter, and filled with the echo of the last take. He sat on the edge of the couch and looked around, eyes lingering on the guitar leaning against the wall, the lyric sheets scattered on the table, the hoodie Jungkook had carelessly tossed on the chair. A strange ache bloomed in his chest, soft, bittersweet, almost like mourning, but not of loss, of possibility, of the life they had always almost had, now finally beginning to take form, and it terrified him. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the ring, the one he had once worn in rehearsals, the one that had marked a future he no longer belonged to. He rolled it between his fingers, the metal cold, foreign now. After a long pause, he placed it on the table, beside the lyric sheet where Jungkook had written, in shaky handwriting, a single unfinished line. "If I asked you to stay, would you still run?" He stared at that line for a long time. When Jungkook returned, the scent of grilled meat and steamed rice filled the room, comforting and grounding. He placed the bags on the table and turned to find Taehyung still seated, hands clasped in his lap, eyes unreadable. "You okay?" Jungkook asked gently. Taehyung looked up. "Yeah," he said, then corrected himself. "No, but I'm trying to be." Jungkook nodded, setting down the drinks. "That's enough." Taehyung reached for the lyric sheet and held it up. "Finish this line with me," he said, voice trembling. "I don't want to keep running." Jungkook hesitated, then crossed the room, sat beside him, and with a pen between his fingers he scribbled beneath the question, "Only if you're running toward me this time." The tension cracked, and something warm passed between them, silent but binding. They ate dinner shoulder to shoulder, knees brushing occasionally, stealing glances they no longer needed to hide. When Taehyung leaned against Jungkook's shoulder and whispered, "Thank you for waiting," Jungkook didn't answer with words. He reached for his hand, held it tight, and pressed a kiss to his temple that said more than any lyric could. Their new music remained a secret between them. A project not born out of label deals or chart ambitions, but out of healing. Each track was a timestamp, a footprint on the path they had taken to return to each other. Some songs sounded like apologies, others like confessions. One track, built around the quiet strum of a ukulele and a barely there falsetto, was simply titled Home. They didn't talk about what would happen when it released. Whether people would dissect every line, guess every meaning, debate the legitimacy of what was clearly, undeniably theirs. They weren't hiding, but they weren't rushing either. The world had stolen enough from them already. For now, it was just theirs. Then came the unexpected call. A representative from a major award show reached out, asking if they'd consider performing a surprise duet. It would be unannounced. No promotions, just a moment, one moment. Taehyung stared at the message on his phone for a long time before turning to Jungkook. "Do we?" Jungkook took the phone, read it, then looked at him. "Do you want to?" "Yes," Taehyung said before he could second-guess himself. "But I want it to be real. No lights, no choreography, just us." "Then that's what we'll give them." And that's exactly what they did. The night of the award show, the crowd buzzed with anticipation. No one expected what came next. The lights dimmed and a single spotlight fell on a stool center stage. Jungkook walked out first, guitar in hand, no fanfare, no graphics, just him. The crowd hushed. Then Taehyung stepped into the light. The gasp that followed rippled like wind. No background dancers, no visuals, just two voices, a guitar, and the weight of a story the world had only ever guessed at. They sang the song they had written in the studio, the one with the lyric that began it all. If I asked you to stay, the arena fell silent. Thousands of people, but not a breath was heard, just their voices. When the final note faded, the silence lingered for a beat too long. Then the room erupted, not in screaming, not in chaos, but in applause that felt like reverence. Like the audience knew they had witnessed something sacred. Backstage, Taehyung and Jungkook sat in silence, fingers still laced together, breathing in sync, hearts pounding. No words passed between them, none were needed, their truth had been sung. The following day, headlines exploded. Taehyung and Jungkook break the internet. Undeniable chemistry. Was that a love song? But neither of them commented, because what they had now was stronger than approval, stronger than gossip. It was peace. Earned, fought for, fragile but real. And in the quiet that followed, in the mornings spent curled together on the studio couch, in the evenings walking home beneath a single shared umbrella, in the moments where their hands found each other without thought, Taehyung and Jungkook finally lived the life they had once only imagined. Not a secret, not a performance, just love, real, messy, beautiful, the kind that doesn't need headlines to matter. The kind that, despite everything, endured. The days that followed their performance passed in a haze of aftermath. For the world, it had been a moment, something surprising, poetic, and worth trending hashtags that lived fast and burned out quickly. But for Taehyung and Jungkook, it wasn't a moment. It was a rupture, and at the same time, a quiet rebirth. They didn't talk about the performance immediately, didn't scroll through reactions or argue over interpretations. They just stayed close. Sometimes in the studio, sometimes in Jungkook's apartment, sometimes on rooftops with takeout containers resting between them. The need to define, explain, or label their connection had evaporated like mist from a mirror. It was enough that it existed. One evening, Taehyung stood at the window of Jungkook's living room, arms crossed as he stared at the skyline. The lights of the city blinked against the dusk, golden and far away, like stars trying to find their place in a world that had forgotten how to be still. Behind him, Jungkook moved around the kitchen quietly, heating up leftovers, his hoodie hanging low off one shoulder, hair messy from sleep. Taehyung didn't turn when he heard the microwave beep. He just said softly, "Do you think we'll regret it?" Jungkook paused, hand hovering over the plate. Which part? Being honest, letting the world see it even a little. Jungkook walked over, leaned against the wall near the window, his eyes fixed on Taehyung's profile. "No," he said. "I think the only thing I regret is how long I pretended you weren't what I wanted." Taehyung let out a slow breath, but his body softened, shoulders dropping. "I used to replay that interview in my head every night," he murmured. "The one where I shut everything down. I'd wonder what would have happened if I just said your name." Jungkook stepped closer. "You don't have to anymore." "But I still do." He turned to face him, eyes searching. "It's not about guilt, Jungkook, it's just memory. Some wounds don't close, they just stop bleeding." Jungkook reached for his hand and pulled him gently in. "Then let me be the one to remind you that you survived it." That night they slept tangled together beneath blankets that smelled faintly of lavender and something softer neither of them named. Jungkook's arm draped protectively over Taehyung's waist, his breath brushing the back of his neck, grounding them both. There were no nightmares, only dreams. In one, they were back on stage, barefoot, singing with nothing but a piano and a string of lights overhead, the crowd silent and listening like they were witnessing something sacred. In another, they were far away from the noise, lying in the grass beside a nameless lake, laughing over nothing, their fingers brushing like it was the first time all over again. When they woke, the sunlight filtered through the curtains like a slow, warm breath, and neither of them moved for a long time, holding on to the quiet before the world noticed they were missing again. The label called that afternoon. Emails were waiting, messages, 100 questions disguised as curiosity. Journalists wanted clarity. Fans wanted confirmation. The industry wanted a plan, but they weren't ready to give it. Jungkook looked at his phone. Then at Taehyung sitting barefoot on the kitchen floor, hair still damp from the shower, legs crossed as he fed pieces of strawberry to their dog, who looked up with comical devotion. Taehyung smiled when he noticed Jungkook watching him and reached for another berry, holding it up like a peace offering. "You okay?" he asked. Jungkook sat down across from him, knees touching. "They want us to speak. Let them wait. You're not scared." "I'm always scared," Taehyung said simply. "But I'm more scared of losing this." "This," Jungkook echoed, smiling softly. "It finally feels like ours." They started writing again, not for an album or a contract, but because the music didn't know how to stay quiet around them. It poured out in slow piano ballads, in acoustic strums under candlelight, in harmonies layered in the way only they could instinctively understand. One afternoon, while revisiting an old track they had abandoned 2 years ago, Jungkook found a melody hidden beneath discarded chords. He played it on loop, head tilted, and Taehyung, listening from the couch, sat up slowly. "One," he said, "that's the one." They rewrote it from scratch. It was a story now about waiting, about walking away and choosing to turn back. They called it Return. The first verse belonged to Taehyung, his voice low, warm, laced with regret but not bitterness. Jungkook joined on the chorus, his falsetto fragile like the sound of a promise still forming. The final bridge, where both voices blended, carried the weight of everything they had never said before. When they finished the final take, they didn't speak. They just sat in the darkened studio, heads bowed, hands still clutching headphones, hearts pounding. It was done, and it was theirs. The song wasn't meant to be released. Not yet, but someone in the studio, someone who didn't know or didn't care, leaked a snippet. It spread like fire. The audio clip was only 20 seconds long, but that was enough. Enough for fans to recognize the emotion. Enough for the industry to speculate. Enough for the past to crash into the present all over again. Hashtags erupted. Theories multiplied. Every frame of their award performance was analyzed again, this time with the lyrics layered over their glances, their body language, their pauses. But instead of panic, Jungkook and Taehyung watched from the sidelines with quiet resolve. "Do we release the full version now?" the label asked. "No," they said in unison, because it wasn't a PR move, it wasn't a strategy, it was a love letter, and it had to be on their terms. So instead they performed it live. One night, one take, a small room, a single camera, no audience except for the ones who truly listened. The video opened with silence, just the sound of breath. Jungkook seated on a stool, Taehyung beside him, a guitar balanced between them. No makeup, no stylists, just two voices and the truth. They sang the song beginning to end. No cuts, no edits. And when the final note faded, they looked at each other and smiled, not for the camera, but for each other. They uploaded it without fanfare. No announcement, just a caption. "This is us." The internet shattered, but they stayed still, stayed grounded, because for the first time they weren't chasing approval. They were living their truth.